So the official time zone is in Tokyo, so I'll say good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Some people are, for some of you, it's morning, for some of you, it's late afternoon, and here is late at night. So good evening, everyone. Welcome.
It's been a long time.
Hi, Trung. Yeah. So I would like everyone just to, we can speak later. There'll be a break. So we'll give a short introduction now and proceed with Professor Gangle's introductory lecture to non-standard philosophy. So hello, everyone. We see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of faces we don't know. So we would like to ask you all to keep your mics switched off, and then during the Q&A, eventually you can all ask Professor Gangle questions. So there'll be two parts lecture. Each part will consist of 45 minutes, and there'll be a short break in between. So I just wanted to say welcome to this international conference dedicated to the work of François Laruelle, and in relation to the Kyoto School, that at least that was our aim. We kind of expanded on the topic, and some presenters will speak in any case on Japanese related themes. So we're hosting this under the TUJ Philosophy Lecture Series, which is a nonprofit forum at Temple University, Japan. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all the participants that will present tomorrow and that are here now and that will have a chance to speak as well. And all of you, in terms of audience, we really did not hope to see this many people come and listen to this quite, let's say, obscure topic still, and especially in relation to Japanese thought. We hope to open up doors and venues to explore this area of philosophical thinking that hasn't been done before, especially not when it comes to Laruelle's work. So we have to hear Professor Rocco Gangle from Endicott College from Boston, Massachusetts, the United States. And he is a translator of multiple works of François Laruelle into the English-speaking world. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Gangle to give us this introductory tutorial or lecture, or whatever we want to call it. And especially, I would just like to add one more thing, that we decided to do this. We had a conference in Brussels 2 years ago. A lot of, let's say, my apologies, I'm still admitting guests. So a lot of researchers and students want to have some kind of source of information besides reading Laruelle's work, which is quite difficult in French or in English. And therefore, I think Professor Gangle will give a really good two-part introduction into Laruelle's thought. And then we invite you all to ask questions or give comments and add to the lecture itself. And we're here all together to figure this out. So without further ado, Professor Gangle, please begin.
Thanks so much, Jordanco. Just wanted to check with my audio coming through fine. Great, thanks. So yeah, thanks so much to TUJ for organizing this conference, and especially to Jordanco for doing the bulk of the behind the scenes work, setting things up and making it possible for us to be here. And thanks also to all of you joining us here today. I will go ahead and share my screen, and I will do my best to speak slowly. I realize many of you might be listening and English is not your first language. So I'll do my best to be as clear as possible. And also, in order to make the audio come through better, I'm going to go ahead and stop my video. So I think the bandwidth hopefully will let the audio come through more clearly. So the talk today is organized in 4 parts. I want to give an overview of Laruelle's entire project, both by thinking about its main themes and also just skimming through the work, at least the bulk of the work that he has produced over the last 3 or 4 decades, to get a sense of the breadth of the project, and then to talk about some of the core concepts and methods of non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy, and then to focus on one particular claim, which I think a very important claim of Laruelle, that non-philosophy may be understood as a science of philosophy. And then finally, to try to indicate a little bit about what has happened in Laruelle's work in the last decade or 2 decades, where he's begun to use the term non-standard philosophy as a kind of next phase of non-philosophy. So maybe just to begin with that terminological point, non-philosophy is a term that emerges in Laruelle's work in the 1980s. It's not meant to negate philosophy, but it's understood as a generalization of philosophical thinking. But because the term sounds negational, he's turned in the last decade or so to increasingly use the notion of non-standard philosophy to emphasize that it is a kind of variant or mutation of philosophy rather than a replacement, rather than a kind of attempt to do something other than philosophy. It's a way of using philosophy in a non-standard way. So I wanted to start with one slide here. I won't go through all these names, but these are individuals that in one way or another have helped me to understand Laruelle better in a personal contact. And then of course there are the many scholars who have worked on Laruelle whose work I might have read, but I just wanted to thank these people in particular for helping me to understand to whatever extent I do. And of course, the greatest thanks to François Laruelle himself, who I think really has given us an extraordinary opportunity to think in new ways. So the essential aspects of non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy, I think, are ways to organize a discipline of thought. This is the ultimate aim of non-philosophy, is to organize a certain practice of thought. And this practice of thought will involve the use of traditional philosophical materials. These can be concepts, arguments, texts, structures, but to use them without the assumption built in that such usage has to be philosophical in form. So non-philosophy takes philosophical material, but doesn't presume that that philosophical material necessarily comes equipped with a philosophical usage. So we have the material, but freed from the form of traditional philosophical use. And closely related to this ability to distinguish usage from material, non-philosophy suspends the authority of philosophy and the avatars of this philosophical authority. So philosophical authority is a term in non-philosophy for the way philosophy presumes its own ability to legislate over itself and other disciplines. And one of the insights of Laruelle is that this self-arrogation of authority is also found in political formations, built into the structure of capital, built into various ways of interpreting experience in terms of sort of global concepts like capital H history or logos or life. And so non-philosophy aims to suspend not just philosophical authority, but the way that philosophical authority structure is at work in other domains that may not seem to be immediately philosophical. And then, as we'll get to in the second part, the claim is that non-philosophy is a rigorous science of philosophy. It is a way of knowing philosophy that is not philosophical in form. At the theoretical level, one of the ways that non-philosophy can be formulated is that it separates the theoretical problem of the one from the philosophical problem of being. And of course, the term one has been a very important term in philosophy, at least since Plato, if not Parmenides. And Laruelle, of course, recognizes this, but he notes that the problem of the one in philosophy has always been linked to the problem of being, either through an identification, if you get, maybe a system like Parmenides or Spinoza, maybe through a movement of transcendence, as in Plotinus or Neoplatonism, but it's seen that the one is a term that functions at the same level as being or the real in a philosophical mode, and that these things are coordinated either through transcendence or immanence or some kind of synthesis. And what Laruelle wants to do is separate this theoretical problem of the one as not having anything to do with the problem of being. Being requires the one, but the one does not require being in order to be thought. And then finally, I think especially in the most recent mode of non-standard philosophy, we can characterize Laruelle's project as being a kind of wager, that's his own term, le pari, a kind of wager on inventive future possibilities that can connect various disciplines. It's not an absolute theoretical certainty. Non-philosophy doesn't claim to somehow know the truth better or in an ultimate mode to replace philosophy, but it is meant to open certain possibilities that may allow, that don't have to allow, but could possibly allow new forms of connection between various domains of thought and experience. So to go through Laruelle's work in a kind of broad overview, I would just point out from the beginning that the best or most representative single volume of Laruelle's work, I think, is the collection called From Decision to Heresy that was released by Urbanomic in 2012. This is a collection of essays primarily and a couple of chapters from books, but it's the only collection, the only single volume collection available that really covers all of Laruelle's work, at least since the beginning of non-philosophy. It doesn't go back to the very earliest work, but it covers things up through the period of non-standard philosophy, and then goes all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s. And at the end, as a kind of appendix, it has the crucial essay, Transvaluation of the Transcendental Method, which I believe was first given as a talk at the Société Française. And I see this as a real turning point in Laruelle's project. I think you could argue that this is the talk in which you first see non-philosophy emerge. And so I wanted to begin with a quote from that talk that I think can be seen as a kind of slogan for what non-philosophy aims to do. Laruelle writes that non-philosophy, or this, he hasn't called it that yet, that this project is to deliver the eidos of the transcendental from its empiricist and formalist limitations by assigning it reality as instance. And so you, I think, can hear the Kantian echo here, where we distinguish empiricism on the one hand, a kind of formalism or rationalism on the other, And of course, the Kantian solution is to introduce the transcendental as a way to resolve the conflict between empiricism and rationalism. And what Laruelle wants to do is a kind of hyper-Kantian project where you take the solution of Kant, thinking in terms of the transcendental, but rather than having the transcendental continue to legislate over experience, the transcendental is freed from its relationship to experience or its relationship to the world and is directly identified with the real, or directly plugged into the real as the one. So it's a delimiting of the transcendental from its functioning in a philosophical mode as a way to legislate experience. So think of Laruelle's project as taking the Kantian solution of the transcendental, but then allowing that to be disengaged from the problem of knowledge and the problem of experience in which the transcendental was originally formulated. So Laruelle's first works were in the 1970s. He wrote his dissertation under Paul Ricoeur, and this was published as Phénomène et Différence, Phenomenon and Difference, essay on the ontology of Félix Ravesson, an interesting 19th century French philosopher. And that work is sort of a linking of aesthetics and ontology. Many of the themes of Laruelle appear there, but it's really in the quartet of books from the late 70s that we get a kind of first formulation of Laruelle's project. And in these 4 books, Laruelle focuses on the relationship between Nietzsche and Heidegger as a kind of problem of hermeneutics. Should we think of meaning as being organized through force in a kind of Nietzschean mode, or do we understand it as a kind of Gelassenheit or letting be of meaning in a more Heideggerian mode? And he also includes in these works the relationship between Derrida and Deleuze. So these 4 thinkers, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze, become a kind of quartet, and Laruelle is sort of juggling with their ideas and trying to make sense of what might hold them together or provide some kind of new synthesis. And then there's a kind of turning point in the early 80s with these 2 books, The Minority Principle and A Biography of Ordinary Man. And these are really the books where, as Laruelle describes it, he discovers the one, and he takes a new way of relating thought to the one, or thinking from the one, that opens up a immediate relationship to what he calls dispersive multiplicities, which are individuals as such, individuals who are not themselves mediated through world or history or any form of authority. So right from the beginning, this discovery of the one is correlated with a certain kind of ethical orientation, right? It's really a matter of how human individuals are able to resist in an ordinary mode the dominance of philosophical authority, right? And this is really the birth of non-philosophy. And then non-philosophy itself is developed in a theoretical register across a number of books. His book, Philosophies of Difference, goes back to that original quartet and takes the figures of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze, and tries to restate the problem of those first 4 books, but now from the standpoint of non-philosophy. So this is Laruelle, in a sense, settling his debts with Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze, and grouping them as variants on the notion of philosophical difference, and then establishing an alternative way of thinking, which is not through difference, but according to the one. And then these other works continue to develop this idea of non-philosophy in increasingly technical and sophisticated ways. Philosophy and non-philosophy is a kind of breakthrough book in 1989. There's a collection of essays and interviews, In as Much as One or As One. Theory of Identities develops its own themes. Principles of Non-Philosophy is a kind of definitive formulation of this main phase that focuses a lot on Husserlian phenomenology. You can think of this as the non-phenomenological version of non-philosophy. There were many collective works that Laruelle was engaged in the 1990s. And one of them is the Dictionary of Non-Philosophy. So that's one aspect of the project that we won't talk about in any detail, but just to realize that this isn't the work of just a single individual, but it really was a collective endeavor. And Laruelle really tried to bring others into collaboration so as to think of non-philosophy as a new form of collaborative project, so that it's a way of thinking that can also be a collective mode of thinking. And I should emphasize that this is not a comprehensive list. These are not all of Laruelle's works. I'm just trying to cover the main books. And then finally, there's the Struggle in Utopia at the End Times of Philosophy is a further for questioning of non-philosophy and its collective dimension. But then there's non-philosophy as applied to various domains or as instantiated in various theoretical questions. And one of the main questions or problems for non-philosophy is ethics. And so there are at least 4 books that try to think according to the one and think in terms of ordinary human experience in a way that recognizes the reality of evil, the reality of various forms of persecution, and the aim, the kind of inversion that Laruelle wants to make in developing a non-philosophical ethics is to think according to the victim, rather than thinking from the philosophical authority standpoint that presumes that one can judge, that one can make decisions. He wants to think, well, what kind of ethics do we develop as we think from the position of those who are simply destroyed, simply annihilated, victimized. There are 2 works that I think are crucial in laying out Laruelle's relationship to psychoanalysis on the one hand, Marxism on the other. The subtitle of Theory of Strangers is Human Sciences, Democracy, and Non-Psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis and Marxism are very important sources for Laruelle because both of them attempt to take traditional philosophical materials in a scientific mode, right? They develop a kind of new form of science to think about either the mind or political reality. And so Laruelle wants to take these kind of breakthrough methodologies of Freud or Lacan and Marx, but then radicalize them through this mode of thinking according to the one. There's a pair of books that apply this method or stance of non-philosophy to photography, and this is Laruelle's main work in aesthetics after the Ravesson book, and those are very interesting in taking the kind of apparatus of the camera as a machine for producing images, but then thinking of these images outside of a representational framework, so that they are no longer trying to capture images of the world, but generating images that are not of the world, images that escape the representational logic of the world in some sense. And Laruelle has been very interested in religion. He has a series of books that approach theology from a number of standpoints. And his focus is usually from a kind of Christian point of view. So he's developing a kind of Gnostic or heretical Christian theology, from Future Christ to one of his most recent books, Clandestine Theology. So this is another kind of angle on Laruelle. And then finally, there's been this turn starting with the Introduction to Generic Sciences in 2000, where there's really a new phase in Laruelle's work that he calls non-standard philosophy. And the two main books here are philosophy, non-standard philosophy, that came out in 2010, and then just recently, 2 years ago, Tetralogos, an opera of philosophies. These are really the two works that stand as kind of a pair of magnum opus level production from Laruelle. They're kind of like the phenomenology of spirit and science of logic of Laruelle, that they're each is a kind of monument, but they kind of work together to form something like a system in a sense of non-standard philosophy. And wedged in there is his very closely linked to non-standard philosophy is his book Responding to Badiou from 2011. So again, that wasn't a complete list, and I think it gives you at least a sense of the breadth of the project. But if we look at the origins of the project, Laruelle is developing themes that I think are relatively standard in contemporary French philosophy. One thing that is a little bit unique with him is his connection to French spiritualism, that he, I think, can be seen as developing this tradition of Mendebiran and Ravesson that's often overlooked, this kind of French dualism that is also, in a funny way, a kind of monism. And I think that would be an interesting place to think about the roots of Laruelle's thought coming out of this French spiritualist tradition. German idealism is very, very important, especially the figures of Kant and Fichte. That Fichte, in particular, just as Fichte was very important for philosophers like Nishida, because of this beginning with a principle of kind of pure activity, right? So finding unity or kind of axiomatic beginning in the act of the mind, that this is a kind of starting point for developing this idea of thinking according to the one. And then the structuralist Marxism and structuralist psychoanalysis of Althusser and Lacan are very important. These would be other ways to kind of approach Laruelle's project. The tradition of phenomenology, especially the kind of theological turn in Levinas and Michel Henry, Levinas in the direction of transcendence, Henry towards a kind of immanence, but in both cases trying to find within experience this kind of radical relationship that would go beyond phenomenological evidence. And then finally, as indicated earlier, there's these philosophies of difference, this quartet, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Deleuze, Derrida, and Laruelle himself has emphasized that the role of Nietzsche in his thought is kind of overwhelming. So if, of these four thinkers, it's really Nietzsche and the problem that Nietzsche sets for philosophy that is, I think, the kind of starting point to out of which Laruelle develops his project. So what are the meat and potatoes of this project? I think the single most important concept in Laruelle's non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy is unilateral duality. So a unilateral duality is a duality that only exists for one side of what is distinguished. And as you can see here, this is a quite complicated formulation. I won't read it in its entirety here, but essentially what Laruelle is doing here, this is taken from En tant qu'un, in as much as one, from he's trying to elaborate this notion of unilateral duality, and he wants to point out that we can think of it at two levels. There's a kind of simple level as he puts it here, X is identical to Y, but Y distinguishes itself absolutely from X. And he says, well, yeah, the side Y is unilateral, but this is still a kind of unitary sense. So think of this as, he's saying, yeah, there is a unilaterality, but he wants to point to something that is more radical, a kind of deep unilateral duality. And he talks about it here in a very complicated way. Right? Y is the absolute. It in no way distinguishes itself from X, but X distinguishes itself from it. Rather, is distinguished from Y by Y itself, by the contingency that Y imprints on it. And the important thing here is that from this relation or non-relation, Laruelle is going to pull out what he calls a dual structure rather than a duality. And so the core idea here for Laruelle is that when we take two terms, even if they are put in a relationship of transcendence or radical distinction by philosophy, if you think of the relationship between the thing in itself and representation for Kant, right? There's a kind of non-relation between the two, and yet they're placed in a relation by thought. Thought actually situates them, even if it situates them in a relationship of transcendence. And what unilateral duality will introduce, if there's a mode of thought that can proceed according to unilateral duality, rather than distinguishing two terms, it would simply separate them. It would not distinguish them in a way that would hold them together in some overarching place or framework, but would allow us to abstract or extract the terms and look at them independently, like fully independently. So I'd like to try to give you an example, because I realize this is quite complicated. But again, the main idea here is there's a kind of ordinary level of unilateral duality, and then something that's more sophisticated, that's related more to philosophy, and that's what Laruelle is ultimately concerned with. So at that kind of simple level, consider in systems theory the relationship between system and environment. That these are two terms, they're distinguished, but the so we think about the difference. Let's represent it by just a line. The distinction between system and environment distinguishes two terms, but that distinction is a distinction that is only recognized or only exists for the system. Right? From the environment's point of view, the system is not a term. The environment just is what it is. And so in traditional systems theory, if you think here about it like an organic system, an organism is the distinguishing of itself from its own environment. So there is a kind of unilaterality here, right? There's the environment doesn't care about the distinction that the system itself is and makes. And so this would be a kind of a useful initial model of unilateral duality. But now consider the philosophical distinction between thought and the real. Here too, we have a kind of distinction, and we can also characterize it as a distinction that belongs to or defines one of the terms, right? Thought is its relationship to the real, at least in, think in a traditional philosophical mode, right? Thought is a kind of orientation toward the real or an aiming at the real. And so we have something that looks like that relationship between system and environment, but the term real for philosophy has a special status. It is the absolute, right? The real would be understood here as something like the henkai pan, the one all. And so there's nothing exterior to the real. The real envelops everything, and therefore it itself must stand in relationship to this distinction. So we have a kind of mirroring or doubling of that unilateral relation between system and environment. Philosophy considers thought as a certain relationship to the real, but it also understands the real in terms of its relationship to thought. So there is a kind of reversibility, but this reversibility can take many different forms. It can take the apparent form of irreversibility, right? Thought can think the real, but the real escapes thought, for example. But that relationship of escape is itself a mode of relating to thought. So this doubling of that unilateral relation is what Laruelle is going to call double transcendence. So non-philosophy's core claim, to the extent that it makes a claim about philosophy, is that all philosophical dualities take the form of double transcendence. In other words, they always take a unilateral duality and mirror it so that it becomes a unilateral duality on two sides. And as soon as it's doubled, it folds back onto itself and then can basically creates a kind of repetition of its own difference at a second order level. So you have both a meta relation and a relation, and those two relations have to relate to each other, and you get a sort of tower, right, or hierarchy of relation, which creates all of the complexity and also fascination of philosophical distinctions. So this structure of double transcendence is going to be closely linked to what Laruelle is going to call philosophical decision, and also the principle of sufficient philosophy. That philosophy claims that it is able to support itself or legislate over itself because it takes the form of double transcendence, because it not only relates to its objects, but it also relates to its own mode of relation. And so it allows itself to survey itself, right? So this power of doubling is the power of a kind of sufficiency. So what Laruelle wants to do is unilateralize this double transcendence. In a certain sense, if we can go back to our example, he wants to take this doubling structure and reduce it to this ordinary or first level unilaterality. And so this will be a problem of operating on the materials of philosophy. How do we operate on a structure of double transcendence in order to simplify it and make it unilateral? And so this would be the contrary term in Laruelle to philosophical decision and the principle of sufficient philosophy and double transcendence. Laruelle calls determination in the last instance the way that a doubling of terms in philosophy, like thought and the real, can actually be understood from a unilateral point of view. Thought and the real are two terms, but we can think of thought as determined in the last instance. So not as related to the real, but precisely as separated from the real, and therefore only in the last instance, only as hallucinated by philosophy, related or connected to the real itself. So this method, this way of taking double transcendence and making it unilateral is the core method of non-philosophy, which Laruelle calls dualysis. So dualysis is not analysis. It is not breaking up a thing, dividing up an object of theoretical study. It is taking something that is already divided and doubled and taking that doubling and reducing it to a kind of unilateral structure, simplifying and therefore separating its terms. So as Laruelle puts here, dualysis does not divide its object, it proceeds by cloning it in the mode of unilateral duality. So once the structure of double transcendence is simplified, the terms are held separate and no longer related to each other in a way that must be repeated or redoubled. through a kind of reflection, what you're left with is exactly the same term. So the concept thought, or the concept transcendental, which comes from philosophy, once dualized, doesn't disappear, and in a certain sense isn't even changed. It doesn't become a new or different concept, but it is cloned. In other words, an exact copy of it appears, but it is a copy that is no longer intrinsically connected with its opposite or its contrary or its dual. And so this is why dualysis and cloning can be thought of as a kind of freeing of the concepts or the objects of philosophy. It doesn't destroy them, it doesn't deconstruct them. Dualysis allows them to be liberated from the limits of their intrinsic relationships to their opposites or their contraries or their differentials. So it merely separates a concept from these determining relationships, right? So that they become something like axioms. They have effects, they have downstream consequences, but those effects and consequences aren't the result of some kind of dialectic with opposites or contraries, but they are generated or produced from the concept itself or from the term itself. So a clone is effectively a term taken from philosophy that becomes axiomatic in form, that becomes operative like an axiom, and in that sense is simplified. No longer has to be balanced or coordinated with other terms, but functions through itself. Okay, well that's the first two sections. It's been about 45 minutes. Let's go ahead and take a break for about 5 or 10 minutes here. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and bring my video back on. I'm going to go get myself a little bit more coffee. Depending on your time zone, I would encourage you to either get some more coffee or some glass of sake. Yeah, let's reconvene, everyone. Return to the let's see. There we go. Hopefully, because everyone we're back and visible. I hope I will go ahead and stop my video again for bandwidth issues. Hope that helps to improve the audio. So just to review very quickly, we have the core concept of non-philosophy, which is unilateral duality, which is a way to think about a certain conceptual structure that allows a term to function in radical independence from some other term. So it is a duality of terms that only functions as a duality for one of those terms. This structure is doubled or mirrored in philosophical dualities so that they become unilateral in both directions and thus no longer unilateral. And then non-philosophy, through the method of dualysis, unilateralizes philosophy and so simplifies these dualities, makes them unilateral. And Laruelle thinks of this in terms of a way of engaging philosophical concepts according to the one. So Laruelle doesn't claim to have a better concept of the one than philosophy, or to have a kind of more deconstructive relationship. Rather, he presumes that the one is what it is, which is the real, and that because the real is radically foreclosed to thought, we are able to look at the dualities that constitute philosophy, right, in a way that is no longer intrinsically connected to the problem of the real, is no longer aiming at or irritated by transcendence or difference from the real. And this method of dualysis, this way of thinking according to the one, I think one of the most striking formulations or one of the most striking claims that Laruelle makes is that this enables a rigorous science of philosophy. So one way we can characterize the project of non-philosophy is that it is a science of philosophy that is no longer philosophical in form. So it is quite clear from the tradition of philosophy that philosophy thinks a lot about itself. So we certainly have various philosophies of philosophy, but we also have various philosophies of science. First and foremost, epistemology, but then also more sophisticated forms of philosophy of science. You might think of Karl Popper or Kuhn or Nancy Cartwright. And so philosophy relates to itself, philosophy relates to science. And what Laruelle wants to do is, in a certain sense, invert this relation and take a scientific point of view on philosophy itself. So I wanted to kind of schematize this by saying, okay, we have two models. If we begin with the idea that there are two modes of thought and some kind of distinction between them. So we have philosophy and we have science. And whatever these terms mean, they have a kind of intrinsic identity. And we're going to put them in some kind of relation. We're going to produce an encounter between philosophy and science. Well, one model for that encounter would be the traditional model in which philosophy gives us a kind of theory of science. And in this case, we have philosophy, let's label it PH, philosophy governing the relationship between philosophy and science. And notice that according to this model, the fact that philosophy is characterized by double transcendence seems to be a principle of legitimation for thinking according to this model. Because if we have two terms, philosophy and science, and our problem is how do we bring them together, right? Under what framework do we think them? The fact that philosophy is capable of formulating both relations and meta-relations. Philosophy both characterizes its relationship to the real, but also characterizes how its relationship to the real relates to the real, and so on. Right? Again, this is the kind of constitutive form of double transcendence that characterizes philosophy. That feature of double transcendence seems to be a way to legitimate philosophy's dominance over the relationship between philosophy and science. Philosophy can reflect on itself, and because it can reflect on itself, it should be able to reflect on and determine how philosophy relates to science. Now, the alternate model would be to treat science as governing this relationship. Right? So I'll just put it like that. Now, Laruelle's claim will be that science thinks in a unilateral mode, and so is naturally correlated with the goals of non-philosophy. And this seems to pose a problem, because if the double transcendence of philosophy legitimates its legislation over the relationship between philosophy and science, then if we try to have a science of philosophy, it seems as if we need to have a second order science of science that will enable science to think about how it would relate to this object. But what Laruelle wants to point out is that science is relatively simple. Rather than double transcendence, science has a simple and straightforward relationship to its objects. And this is where I think it's very helpful to take very, very ordinary ideas about science and not think in abstractions, but consider the science of botany, the science of flowers, right, plants. Well, how does botany engage its objects? It can develop very, very complicated and sophisticated models through which it knows flowers or plants. But what science doesn't need to do in order to know the structure of flowers is think about what science itself is. There's a kind of naive relationship to its object that is actually what makes science so interesting and powerful. Another way to think about it is a botanist doesn't pose the question, do flowers exist? A botanist presumes that there are flowers. Flowers are discovered, not invented, not co-constituted by science. Flowers are there as a presupposed starting point, and then the scientist steps in a secondary role in order to know them. And so this second model, which will be the model of non-philosophy, will be a way of treating philosophy not as something that has to be constituted through its own knowing, so as then to be able to know other things like science, but it will simply aim at or orient itself towards philosophy in a simple or direct mode. So this is a passage from an essay of Laruelle in the mid-80s, Revolution Within the Limits of Science Alone. And here he formulates his own kind of image of how science works or how science thinks. He writes, science spontaneously or a priori makes a triple distinction. And I think an interesting point here is Laruelle is going to make the claim at the end of the day that science is a more simple form of knowing, a more unilateral mode than philosophy. But in order to generate that simplicity or that unilaterality, it actually seems to be more complex. We introduce a triple distinction where philosophy traditionally has a kind of duality structure, say thought and the real, or immanence and transcendence. Science is going to distinguish three terms, but by making a threefold distinction, it will actually be able to simplify its relationship to its object. So what is this threefold distinction? Well, first of all, there are the material givens out of which knowledge is constructed. And again, a useful example here would be botany, or let's say geology. Geology doesn't constitute the object rock or earth. The earth and its various strata of stone and rock and soil, it's just given, right? It's presupposed by the scientist. It isn't problematized in its existence, it's discovered. So we begin in a secondary mode where the material to be thought is contingently present to us. Science then generates its objects of knowledge, or Laruelle calls them the okay. This kind of, he often algebraicizes his terminology in order for us to think in that mode where we don't think about the internal structure, but we think of it in a sense from the outside. So we have the okay, the object of knowledge, which is the result of the work that the scientist makes upon the material that is given. So it's the result of this work that is an object that constitutes itself according to certain rules or procedures. And I think the best way to think about the object of knowledge is in terms of the idea of a scientific model. Scientists do not examine things in the world. Scientists, or rather, let's say, scientists do not know things in the world. Things in the world are objects of philosophical scrutiny. What scientists study are models of things in the world. A physicist doesn't care about electrons. A physicist cares about an atomic model in which an electron as a term has a certain role. So scientific models are theoretical constructions that are extracted from the material that is originally given. And then Laruelle introduces as a third term, there's the RO, or real object, which is distinct from the object of knowledge. The real object of scientific knowledge, as he puts it here, the scientist relates to this in a very particular mode. So what we know as scientists is a model. It doesn't mean that we don't necessarily hold a certain kind of realism. A physicist wants to know about electrons as the real object. But the important point is that there's a radical distinction between the electrons that are out there in the world, the real object, and electrons as they function in the theoretical model, which are what are actually known in a scientific mode. So again, we distinguish three things: the given material from which we start, the scientific model or object of knowledge that's produced in the scientific work, and then the thing at which the model is directed, which is the ultimate or real object, which is not what the scientist knows, but what the scientist hopes his or her knowledge ultimately uncovers or ultimately discloses. So this is a continuation of the essay. And here then Laruelle points out that what makes this approach, this threefold distinction, different from double transcendence or the kind of dualities of philosophy is that from Laruelle's point of view, philosophy always posits some kind of relationship between the object of knowledge and the real object. Philosophy, in a sense, conflates the object of knowledge and the real object, even when they're held to be distinct. If you think of Kant, for example, the object of knowledge is distinct from the thing in itself, but they are understood to hold together in some way. There's some kind of philosophical synthesis that means that those two things are an intrinsic relationship to one another. Whereas the scientist makes, as Laruelle puts it here, a radical discontinuity between the object of knowledge and the real object. And one way that I think this can be made sense of is to say that for philosophy, the real object is always a component term in the object of knowledge, even if it's a component term in the form of transcendence. So the thing in itself is going to be an element of the structure of philosophical knowledge for Kant. Whereas for a scientific approach, the real object is in no way a component of the object of knowledge. And maybe a good example here, a good illustration would be mathematical knowledge, right? Certainly, mathematicians presume that arithmetic operations allow us to count objects in the world, right? We can count apples, add them together, and so forth. But when a mathematician talks about arithmetic operations on numbers, he or she has to be very careful that apples, components in the world, things, don't become component parts of the definition or the understanding of, let's say, the natural numbers. Even if the natural numbers are useful for knowing how to count things in the world, we can't see that relationship between natural numbers and things in the world as constitutive of the natural numbers. There has to be a kind of radical discontinuity between the theoretical model and the worldly thing. And so, as Laruelle puts it here, there is a kind of asymmetry or unilaterality of determination, a static duality in which the second term, here the model, representation or knowledge, is absolutely contingent in relation to the first, the real object, and it cannot determine it in return. The model does not act on the world. The natural numbers do not determine apples, right? And so apples cannot enter into constitutive relationships or constitutive determinations of those numbers. This duality, right, this unilateral duality, which unilateralizes representation, is the condition of a science and distinguishes it from the philosophical operation. So what is the upshot here? Laruelle is giving us an understanding of science that conforms very closely to his understanding of unilateral duality. He's basically saying science knows or generates knowledge in a unilateral mode, in distinction from philosophy, which generates knowledge in a kind of dual or double transcendence mode. And that means that if we turn the tables and look at philosophy from a scientific stance, the structures of double transcendence are simplified. We can extract a model of philosophy, and in fact, the model is the idea of double transcendence, a model that doesn't have to be constitutive of the form of knowledge that we ourselves are using. In other words, we can generate a model of philosophy without having to know that model in a philosophical mode. And as he says here, it's not enough to just talk about the kind of fact of science, maybe in a kind of Kantian mode, that Newton gives us Newtonian mechanics, but in order to ground Newtonian mechanics, we need philosophical reflection. Rather, science thinks. Simply, it doesn't think like philosophy. It only objectifies its representations, not the real itself. And consequently, it has a more primitive and more essential naivete than the secondary naivete that pertains to philosophical practice, even in its most exacerbated operations of critical vigilance. And I think an illustration of this latter point would be the way that a traditional move, especially in contemporary philosophy, is this goal of coming back to the ordinary, right? If you think of ordinary language philosophy after Wittgenstein, or in the late Husserl, the idea of a kind of return to the life world as a way of grounding the possibility of phenomenological reduction. And in those returns to the ordinary, philosophy is always presuming that the ordinary is a kind of simplicity that only philosophy itself would fully understand. So in ordinary language philosophy, there's an attempt to resist philosophical abstraction, resist philosophical sophistication, but by a return to the ordinary. And that return to the ordinary is exactly the opposite of what science does. Science is incredibly sophisticated, right? Again, a botanist doesn't accept ordinary understandings of flowers, but what remains ordinary is never breaking with that initial relationship to the material. The scientist is naive in simply presupposing that there are flowers. All of the sophistication of science goes into constructing the model, not in trying to understand the real object. Whereas philosophy, when it makes a kind of return to naivete or return to the ordinary, always thinks of the ordinary then as a way of recuperating the real. And so in this difference between the simplicity of science and the kind of duplicity of philosophy, Laruelle thinks that there is a possibility to treat philosophy from a naive or ordinary point of view, right? To simplify it and then know it scientifically. All right, so then the final section, and this has to be very, very schematic. The work involved in this last stage is very sophisticated and complex and rich, and so there's really no way to do justice to it in an introductory mode. But I still want to talk about what's involved here, because I think it's really where Laruelle's project reaches its culmination, right? It reaches a kind of fruition in this, basically in the last decade, since about 2010. And this is where Laruelle gives the name non-standard philosophy as a kind of further phase or further expression of non-philosophy. So I think this new phase is characterized, on the one hand, by an increased emphasis on creative possibility. Rather than the aim to know science scientifically and thereby open it up or generalize it, here there's more of a kind of horizontal emphasis on how reduced or simplified philosophy might allow for new connections or new possibilities, creative possibilities, with art, science, technology, political formations, and so forth. And that one of the terms that comes to the fore in this later work is philofiction. This term actually goes all the way back to the earliest stages. I think it appears in philosophy and non-philosophy, but it's just a word that pops up once in a while. Whereas the idea that there could be a discipline of philofiction. So this would be a mode of writing that would stand with respect to philosophy as science fiction stands with respect to science, right? A kind of grounding of creative expression in a certain disciplinary mode. And so he wants to emphasize a kind of creative potential that would come out of non-philosophy. And then in non-standard philosophy, there's an increasing positive role for philosophy. And this is especially the case in the Laruelle's most recent book, Tetralogos, where philosophy is no longer treated solely in terms of its authoritative and oppressive and persecutorial tendencies, but is a kind of opening that is available to humans so that they can ultimately accede to a kind of universal dimension. So the philosophy is no longer a negative term, even in the kind of very nuanced negativity of non-philosophy. And finally, there's the new concept of the generic, that this phase of non-standard philosophy begins with Laruelle's book, Introduction to Generic Sciences. And this is one of the key terms in this phase, to develop this idea of science of philosophy. Now we think of science as being thinkable in a peculiar mode. In a certain way, it is the science of science itself. It is science as generic. So science as not any particular science, not botany or geology or astrophysics, but science as such. But this science as such can also be a mode in which one thinks according to the various plural sciences. So the very idea of the generic is it's a way in which one can organize concepts that is that blurs the distinction or even annuls the distinction between the singular and the plural. And you might think here, I think a good model of this from the work of Robert Brandom and Wilfrid Sellers is the idea of a distributed singular term. Sellers talks about in chess, for example, one speaks of how the pawn moves or how the bishop moves. So the bishop or the pawn is a singular term, right? We talk about the pawn, and yet the pawn is a representative of the entire class of pawns. And so it's an interesting grammatical formulation when we can say, you know, how does the zebra eat? We're talking about an individual zebra, but it's the zebra as the generic representation of all zebras. And so this is the generic science would be a science, but it's an a science that is all sciences. And so these are kind of the pieces that Laruelle is going to assemble in order to generate what I think is just very extraordinary work over the last 10 years. Before getting to the two main books of non-standard philosophy, I think a useful way to think about what's new in non-standard philosophy. How is it both a continuation of non-philosophy, but also a different phase or a new phase? I think non-philosophy can be thought of as supplementing or extending philosophy by subtracting. So it's subtractive, supplemental. Its initial operation is subtractive, and through that subtraction, there's an extension or supplementation. In non-standard philosophy, there's a supplementation as the initial operation, and through that supplementation, there is an effect of subtraction. And to give you a sense then of what that might mean, I think there are some useful mathematical models. And these are models that are used explicitly by Laruelle himself. So this first model, which is really the primary analogy that Laruelle uses to explain what he means by the non in non-philosophy. He says, well, think about the non in non-Euclidean geometry. As you probably know, in the 19th century, after centuries of reflection on Euclid's 5 postulates for geometry, there's this parallel postulate that for any line and point not on that line, there is exactly one line that is parallel. And of all the axioms or postulates of Euclid, this is the one that is kind of complex, and mathematicians were hoping to show that it could be derived from the others, and they'd never been successful. And in the 19th century, it was shown that this postulate or axiom is independent of the others. And in fact, there are modes of consistent geometry that don't use this axiom, and in fact introduce another axiom. Either there are infinitely many lines that are parallel, or there are none at all. And so this is the rise of non-Euclidean geometry. But notice how that non works. The non in non-Euclidean geometry doesn't say that Euclid is false. It doesn't negate Euclidean geometry. It simply shows that Euclidean geometry is not sufficient to know all possible forms of space. Euclidean geometry is perfectly valid in its own right? Has a certain kind of autonomy, but it's a limited autonomy. And we can subtract the parallel postulate from Euclidean geometry, and we actually then open up a much larger space of models that would satisfy those reduced axioms. And so this idea of moving from Euclidean to non-Euclidean geometry, notice that it can be thought of in kind of in 2 steps. First, we subtract an axiom, right? We remove the parallel postulate or the parallel axiom, and that opens up this extended space, right? There are now many possible forms of geometry, but we don't have a non-Euclidean geometry until there's a second movement of supplementation. Either in Lobachevskian or Riemannian geometry, we add or replace the parallel postulate with a new axiom. So the kind of order of operations here is subtract, remove an axiom, and then substitute or supplement with a new one. And I think this is parallel to how non-philosophy works by subtracting the axiom of double transcendence, taking the idea that all of these dualities in philosophy have to be mirrored through their contrary terms. So we remove double transcendence, simplify the structure. This opens up a larger space of models for thinking, but then we would need to step in and actually introduce in an axiomatic way the concepts or the regions or the objects that we want to think, right? We don't just sort of contemplate the space of possibility, but we perform non-philosophy with respect to given materials. Well, in non-standard philosophy, I think the order of operations is reversed. Both parts are there. There's a supplementation and there's a subtraction, but here there's a subtraction by way of supplementation. And I think there are three interesting examples from contemporary mathematics. And these are all referred to by Laruelle in various ways. And the first is, I think, where the term non-standard comes from. Abraham Robinson in the 1960s rehabilitated the notion of infinitesimals in calculus. And this is what he calls non-standard analysis. Well, how non-standard analysis works is by taking the real numbers and adjoining to the real numbers neighborhoods of infinitesimals around every real number. So in a very intuitive way, think of this as taking the real line, which we think of as a continuum, and making it even more dense or rich with numbers or points, right? It sort of, it supplements the real numbers by filling in around each real number a kind of cloud of infinitesimals. So we add a whole bunch of stuff to the real line, but as a result of this supplementation, what we can do in non-standard analysis is perform the operations of differential calculus and integral calculus in a purely algebraic way. So we no longer need the kind of complex and unwieldy apparatus of limits. Instead of having to take the limit of, say, a tangent to a curve, we simply pull out the right infinitesimal. So we can operate upon the infinitesimals themselves instead of having to take the limits of, say, of secants as they approach a certain point. So by giving us more objects, more parts to the real line, we get a simplified structure at the level of our actual calculations. So by supplementing, we subtract the kind of complexity of the work we have to do. A second example, and one that is very important for Laruelle, and which he also shares with Alain Badiou, is the notion of generic forcing, coming from the work of Paul Cohen, also in the 60s. And here, if the idea of a generic extension of a model of set theory and the technique of forcing, one begins with a relatively impoverished model, a countable model of set theory, and then one adjoins a generic set. So again, very much like Robinson's non-standard analysis, we enrich a structure by adding a bunch of stuff to it. But by adding or adjoining a generic extension, this allows us control that can do things like subtract the application or the satisfaction of certain properties. For traditionally, or most importantly, the continuum hypothesis of Cantor in Cohen's original work. And without going into any of the mathematical details, it just, on some level, there's a similar structure of generating a kind of simplicity, right? Finding a kind of calculation result that one wants in a simple mode by enriching a domain, adding stuff to it. And I think that maybe the clearest example, and this is one that's very important for Laruelle in his book, Non-Standard Philosophy, is if you think of the field extension, whereby given the real numbers, by adjoining the term square root of -1. So the real numbers allow us to do all kinds of things. We can add, multiply, divide, and so forth. But one thing we can't do is take square roots of negative numbers. When we work with the reals, there's no answer to the equation x squared plus 1 equals 0. There's no answer to it. But if we posit the existence of a term I, that's the wonderful, just kind of notation of, lowercase I, and we assign the value square root of -1 to this term, and then we affirm the operational closure of our algebraic operations. So we take our real numbers, we adjoin one thing, we supplement just a single term I, and then we say all the operations that we care about, multiplication, addition, and so on, we allow those to generate freely all the new terms that result. This gives us an extended field, the field of complex numbers. And interestingly, when we have this enriched field of complex numbers, there are certain properties of the reals that are lost. In particular, the reals are totally ordered, which means if you're given any two real numbers, one is either A is bigger than B is bigger than A, or they're the same. In the complex numbers, that's not true. The complex numbers cannot be totally ordered. And so this is a wonderful example of supplementing, right? Adding stuff to a domain, but by adding to it, we actually lose properties, right? Or we subtract certain structures. In this case, we subtract total ordering. So again, this is just kind of a mathematical analogy, but it's one that Laruelle himself uses, and I think it gives a good flavor of what the project is about in general, right? Non-philosophy, in its broadest sense, is about taking philosophy and trying to enrich it, enlarge it, and at the same time reduce it in terms of its authoritative dimension, right? To enlarge its space of possibilities and reduce its authority over other domains. And the difference between non-philosophy and non-standard philosophy is the relationship between these two dimensions of subtraction and supplementation. So the two main books from this period are non-standard philosophy and Tetralogos. But I think we would also include in this period the two books on, or at least the second book on non-standard aesthetics, which takes the domain of photography. There's also the recent book Clandestine Theology, that takes the domain of Christian theology. Also Christofiction is in this domain. And then these are the two main books that we'll turn to in a second. But what each of these works does is take some external domain, and instead of applying non-philosophy to it, the domain itself, it becomes a kind of saturation. One immerses oneself in the field of photography or the field of theology, and then operates a kind of supplementation of non-philosophy. So rather than applying a method to a domain, it's a matter of immersing oneself in a domain and then allowing, enriching that domain from within. It's a subtle difference in method, but I think it's one that that makes Laruelle's project even more interesting. And so just in a very schematic way, the two main books from this period, the first is Non-Standard Philosophy, Generics, Quantics, Philofiction, that appeared in 2010. And just to give you a very broad overview of the project here, if we go back to our problem of philosophy and science, recall that Laruelle distinguishes a relationship between philosophy and science that's dominated by philosophy, right? From a non-philosophical relationship, which would be organized through science. Put it, to schematize it like this. So we have a redoubled structure. Philosophy appears twice, and then we have the non-philosophical point of view in which science is simple, right? Science doesn't redouble itself, and so has a kind of simple or unilateral relationship to philosophy. So what Laruelle wants to do is continue with this second model, right? Have a kind of science of philosophy, but now the relationship of science to philosophy is qualified as generic. So we think of the way in which we approach philosophy as being not some particular science, but the scientific approach as such, which is treated as a new term, right? There's no particular science. You can't go to university and study generic science the way you can study geology or physics. And so we need a new term for the kind of relationship that one has to philosophy when one does non-philosophy. So we have this qualified term, generic science. And in order to make sense of the form of relationship of generic science to philosophy, we actually introduce a particular science, quantum mechanics. So interestingly, Laruelle's new picture, in which science appears twice, once as generic science and once as the particular science of quantum mechanics, starts to look a lot more like this first model of philosophy. It's as if we have the same redoubled structure that Laruelle wanted to critique or avoid. And in that sense, it is a kind of partial return to the model of philosophy. The important point is one doesn't introduce this relationship between quantum mechanics and generic science as a doubling or kind of Nietzschean reaffirmation of science. Instead, the way that quantum mechanics and generic science interact simplifies both. So by having two terms, a particular science, quantum physics, and a general or generic science, in that interaction, both are simplified and stripped of their authority. So Laruelle continues to emphasize the suspension of authority. It's just that now that suspension of authority occurs through a kind of supplementation or doubling of science through its generic form and a particular form of physics. And I think it's worth posing the question to Laruelle, well, what if we, couldn't we do the same thing over here? Couldn't we say, well, let's treat philosophy and just, we have a generic philosophy and then we take some particular philosopher, say Plato, and then we have a new way of thinking about science. And in a certain sense, this is exactly what Laruelle will do in his second work from this period, Tetralogos. But notice that this actually helps us to see what's ultimately at stake in this difference between philosophy and science. That Plato is both one philosophy, but it's one philosophy that also presents itself as being all of philosophy. Constitutively, philosophy always tries to grasp the identity of philosophy as such. In other words, philosophers are ultimately arguing over who gets to stand for philosophy as such. That's not true for scientists. A quantum physicist does not argue that they are more of a scientist than a botanist, or at least they don't if they don't become philosophers and try to impose some kind of reductionist theory, right? In principle, each science enjoys a kind of autonomy and doesn't have to contest the identity of science with respect to the other sciences. There's an intrinsic plurality, a kind of peaceful pluralization of the sciences that is not true of philosophy. So this strategy, right, of doubling science so as to reduce its authority and give it a new relationship to philosophy, it's not symmetrical to philosophy. It won't work in philosophy because philosophy doesn't have this intrinsic pluralization. If it did, if philosophers were capable of relating to one another the way that scientists in different disciplines could, then we would have a kind of utopian space of philosophy. And in fact, that's exactly what Laruelle thinks he can achieve through his scientific knowing of philosophy. Philosophers are reduced in their claims to sufficiency and therefore no longer have to contest the identity of philosophy or who ultimately possesses philosophy. So this is just a very schematic picture of what Laruelle is doing in a book that stretches almost to 600 pages. So to give you a sense of the scope, this is an outline, but this is a book that is a kind of continent unto itself. And the same is true of the most recent book of Laruelle, which I think in many ways is the culmination of his entire project. It's really an extraordinary work, Tetralogos, an opera of philosophies, which is in a certain way presumes the previous work, non-standard philosophy, and then situates that work, situates its theoretical results inside the domain of music. And so it enriches the very idea of music so as to allow music to become a kind of model for the universe as a whole. And to continue with our kind of schematic picture, we have that same relationship of generic science to philosophy, but Laruelle now characterizes philosophy as philosophie forcée. So it's forced philosophy, where forced here comes from the notion of generic forcing in Paul Cohen. So philosophy is forced in the sense that it is reduced to a kind of bare model or ground model, and then allowed to be extended in various ways, right? Forced in various ways, arbitrarily, according to adjoining the generic. And just as in non-standard philosophy, there is a relationship here. The third term in this structure is quantum mechanics. So, I'm not sure if this will. Quantum mechanics. But what's new in Tetralogos is taking this relationship between the three terms, generic science, quantum mechanics, and philosophy as forced. This entire structure then is thought of as a kind of enrichment of the domain of music. So music as a kind of aesthetic production, a mode of representation, especially in the form of the opera or the oratorio, right? A kind of narrative structure, but also a kind of resonance or physical structure. Music as this kind of rich domain of expression and reality becomes the space in which non-standard philosophy is actually instantiated. And the way Laruelle characterizes this project, Tetralogos, is he thinks of it as a kind of inversion of the Socratic claim from the Phaedo, where Socrates hears this kind of the voice of the muse who tells him, you should be making more music. And Socrates reflects and says, well, maybe I've been doing that anyway, because philosophy is the best music or the greatest form of music. So this is a kind of mystical Socratic claim as he approaches death and as facing death in the Phaedo. And Laruelle turns this around and thinks, well, what if we think of music as the best philosophy? What would it mean to invert the Socratic claim and make music the best philosophy? And he introduces the concept of a kind of unheard, a beautiful unheard, what is unsounded and yet is a form of music. So the beauty of the belle insonore, the beautiful unheard as possibly the best philosophy, this kind of silent music. And then just to conclude, this is his kind of picture of the project of Tetralogos. Again, the three terms being philosophy as forced, generic science, and quantum mechanics as the physical realization of this relationship. Says it's a tripartite yet unified construction that is the locus of every human mode of dwelling, from the earth to the universe. So he has a kind of threefold ascent where you go from the cave, the Plato's cave, to the earth or the world, and then extending beyond the world to the universe. So this kind of ascent from the cave to the universe, or indeed from birth to musical messianity, passing through the space of the generic human. So we can pass from the birth, the kind of biological birth into the species, to the becoming human, and then on to something beyond the human, this kind of musical messianity. And I think that's what's fascinating in this final work, most recent work of Laruelle, is the introduction of a kind of narrative dimension, which is something that is not there in earlier modes of non-philosophy, that he's giving us a kind of framework in which the story of creation and the story of life is told, right? But it's told in the form of a kind of musical oratorio. And so there's an entirely new dimension in which I think if this work is successful, and I think it is, Laruelle has finally found a way to integrate his theoretical construction of non-philosophy with an aesthetic production, a kind of philo-fiction, and has realized the kind of project that he signaled even as early as his dissertation with Ravesson, of finding a way to do philosophy in an aesthetic mode, to do philosophy as art. And that's, I think, at least the stakes of this final work. So thank you very much. Arigato gozaimashita for listening to this tutorial. Is the references that were actually in the talk. And I look forward very much to hearing your comments and questions as we get ready for the conference that begins tomorrow. So yeah, please feel free. I have not seen anything in the chat, but I can go ahead and open the chat now. Maybe if I can turn things back to Jordanco for a minute, was there any way you wanted to organize the Q&A?
I would like to thank you for this great introduction, and you covered quite a lot of ground actually and packed it into portions of 45 minutes. There's a lot more to say about all of the topics you touched upon, and I think we'll do that exactly in the Q&A. So it's getting late here in Tokyo, so I'm just I want to if we can be mindful of the time and just not go over too much. Now it's like almost 11 p.m. here, before midnight. So I guess whoever wants to leave, you're free to leave. Whoever wants to stay longer, we'll try to see and do as we go and see where it takes us. So tomorrow, just if anyone is planning to leave, and I know some participants wrote in the chat and they said they have to leave, we'll start earlier, 2 hours earlier. So it's going to be 7 p.m. evening time here in Tokyo, which means wherever you are, deduce 2 hours, and that's going to be the beginning. Actually, 10 minutes before, because we have an opening address by the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs of TUJ. So we would like to support him, because he made this possible. Actually, without his support, we wouldn't be able to do this. And then we'll have quite a packed day, actually, with 5 presentations, if I'm not mistaken, including the keynote. So there's a lot to cover, and I'm sure you're eager to address questions to Professor Gangle, and there are a few in the chat. So if we can just scroll up, we have Syed, I think. That's quite early in the presentation given by Professor Gangle that says, but what if the environment is entirely composed of systems? That's when you were comparing systems and environment. And then I think more elaborate questions are given by Jeremy and Sophia, as well as Drew and Mahbub. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. So actually we have a lot of questions, and here's Yu Chen as well. I'll let you choose, Rocco. You just go ahead and pick whatever you want to address right now. And for those questions that won't be addressed, I guess we can find another way, maybe by email or address it in a different way. So let's see where it takes us. So also, if you have any questions, which are not in the chat, and just if you like to speak directly to Professor Gangle and address it right now, go ahead as well.
Yeah, and I would recommend, just because I can only see a few people on the bar at top, I think the best way to, if you have a question, and it would be great I would love to interact verbal, in sort of face to face. So if you do have a question, feel free to, if you hit the reaction button at the bar on the bottom, I think there should be a way to raise hand. And if you hit raise hand, then it marks that you sort of have something to say, and then that way we can maybe keep track. And then I think the best way to proceed is probably I'll go through and just read the questions that are there in the chat, and then
We
see
have,
if
sorry to interrupt you, Rocco.
Sure.
We have Jeremy, and if you hit the raise hand button, you'll be, moved to the top of the queue, and we can see it right there at the top of the screen. So Jeremy, Mahbub, and Yu Chen are already. So if you guys can just reformulate your questions, restate it in a way that it's more conversational, and go ahead at it with Professor Gangle.
So yeah, I think, why don't I'll read through the questions in the chat, because I don't want to leave those, but I'll read through the questions, see if I can address them kind of on block, and then maybe turn to the people in person. So the question, but what if the environment is entirely composed of systems? And that's a great question. I'll come back to that in a second. Jeremy's, well, maybe I'll let Jeremy ask or reformulate the question maybe on his own in a second in person. And then, okay, and from Sophia Samitsi, it's such an absolutely difficult attempt to create a theoretical space, therefore the possibility of connecting philosophy and science. What is the structure of the real and the role of intersubjective experience? So that will be a key problem, this idea of intersubjectivity. That is this a kind of solipsism, or what is the collective or collaborative dimension? From Drew, emphasis on creative possibilities, any interdisciplinary projects. So again, this problem comes up in a couple different modes, and then yeah, Mahbub has a very complicated question that maybe I'll let him ask that more in person, because I think that way it'll be more interesting for everybody.
I think all the questions are quite complex and in multiple parts. Actually, they address different things. So maybe it's better to let them reformulate it and restate it in a way that's, more easy to converse with, and then maybe rely on the chat and see if we miss anything.
Perfect.
Address that as well.
So let me just address very quickly the question about environment, and then we can turn to Jeremy and Mahbub and Yu Chen. I think that this is exactly the question. If the whole idea of unilateral duality presumes that the duality is a kind of construction, that if the environment is entirely composed of systems, then we're already presuming a philosophical point of view where the difference between system and environment is a real distinction. In other words, if there are only systems and all the systems that are non-X are the environment for the system X, then we're working inside a kind of idealist picture in which the system environment difference is the only thing there is. These differences might mutually include each other and be very complicated, but we're already inside a kind of idealism. And that's why the kind of simplicity or naivete of at least ordinary systems theory presumes that there is an environment. It's just the environment is a kind of term equal X. Each system has its own environment, its own processing, but we presume that there's a reality out there that is not a system. And again, I think it's a great question because it shows how this problem of basically the thing in itself is such a rich problem, and the relationship between idealism and realism is not something that's resolvable or solvable, but is sort of built into the problem of thought. It's just a question of how do we deal with this idea? How do we deal with the relationship of system and environment, or the relationship of thought and real? So yeah, but yeah, I'm interested to hear from you all. So maybe, yeah, just going in order, Jeremy, and then Mahbub, and then Yu Chen. So yeah, Jeremy, go ahead. I think you need to be unmuted. I'm not sure if I can do that.
You should be able to unmute yourself right now.
Okay, perfect. Excellent.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Rocco, and thank you, Jordanco, for organizing this event. So just a couple of things, actually. I mean, I have two questions, and I won't take up too much time because I know how late it is in the evening I wanted to bring up kind of like a question regarding positioning the most recently published manuscript. I don't know if you've read it recently, but it's Le Nouvel Esprit Technologique, the new technological spirit. And it seems to me that this recently published manuscript, with the help of Anne-Francois Schmidt and some other individuals with the archives, are trying to put this together to kind of republish or reproduce material that hasn't been published before. And I'm not sure if you've read it, but I was wondering if you have, and where along those lines you would place it in the entire oeuvre of philosophy 1 or philosophy 2, because I feel like there's a break inside of this text that goes between technology or philosophy as a technology to more of a tool to draw from and invent newer practices of thought. So that's my first question. My second question, since I know that you're translating non-standard philosophy with Taylor, if I'm not mistaken, one of the questions, since it's a large book, it's a very hard book to get through, and the possibility of invention always lingers with my own work and my own research. I was wondering if you could speak more about the notion of the wager in that book, particularly with regards to the wagering on generic chance and as a form of future thinking or future think, pensée future. So my question is more so along the lines of, let's say, the wager in relation to the futural, democracy, and invention. Must the non-philosophical wager deal solely with the image of thought and not the invention of new human practices? Because I feel like the greater deal of non-philosophy is it's in liberation of thought, of course, but also in the invention of democratic practices of thought. And I'm wondering if if it must stick to only, the non-philosophical wager must only stick to the image of thought. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks. And these are both great questions. The first one is easy to answer because I have not read Nouvel Esprit Technologique. I've seen that it's out, but I just haven't picked it up yet. But it does. My hunch is that it's probably quite closely aligned with the more recent work of Anne-Francois Schmidt, who is Laruelle's spouse, but they've also worked kind of in parallel, on parallel tracks for quite some time. And Professor Schmidt has done very interesting work in sort of design theory and interdisciplinarity and philosophy of science. And so her work links in a very interesting way with François Laruelle, because she is working hewing much more closely to these kind of disciplinary concerns. And she's written a very interesting book with a collaborator, I've got it right, Muriel Mambrini-Dudet. It's a book called Epistemologie générique. And it's and I think that approach seems to be very much like what you're talking about, thinking of these kind of very concrete methodologies for bringing different disciplinary approaches together. So to think of science and knowledge as a kind of colossal, multidimensional design problem. So it's not about epistemology, but it's more about something like critical design, and finding ways to get research teams to communicate with one another, collaborate, and finding these modes of mediation and integration. And I do think that Laruelle's more recent work shows us ways that might happen. It gives us good tools, especially for thinking about the way that we can extract formal tools from sciences like quantum mechanics. That I think it's an amazing project in non-standard philosophy that Laruelle doesn't attempt to give us a philosophy of quantum mechanics. And he's very explicit that that's the last thing he wants to do, is give us another philosophy of quantum physics, but instead to pull from quantum physics, which has its own autonomy as a science, certain structures like superposition, non-commutativity, of matrix algebra, and say, like, look, here are tools that are effective in a mathematical domain, in mathematical physics. Can't we translate them or appropriate them in a conceptual domain and use our concepts in a new mode? So that what if we use our philosophical concepts according to a logic of superposition rather than the traditional logic of say classical logic? And I think this is a really great model for how we can do those kinds of things. Is like look at different disciplines and extract certain formal procedures so that we can apply them in other domains in a creative mode. And as for your second question, about sort of democracy and I'm trying to think exactly how. Can you remind me just in the way you put it in one term?
So if I could rephrase my question, I'd like to kind of give you a refresh. What is must the non-philosophical wager, which is a way of futural thinking, or yes, thinking the future, thinking future, must it always be, must the non-philosophical wager deal solely with the image of thought and not the invention of new human practices that are not determinable of thought?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I think what I really like about the language of wager in non-standard philosophy is I think it, like Laruelle at his best, it's a very complex and sophisticated, rigorous mode of thinking, but it's a mode of thinking that ultimately takes us back to something that is very, very ordinary and clear and straightforward. And one thing that I think Laruelle wants to do is just genuinely think from the concrete. And one of the things that Laruelle does that I think is very rare in contemporary philosophy is take seriously the radical contingency of our relationship to the future. People talk about contingency all the time, crisis and unknowability, but they're always thinking from the standpoint of a kind of almost smug sense that they have grasped that contingency. Like, oh, I know that we are in crisis, or I know that we cannot grasp the hyperobject. But none of these forms of knowledge, even in the negative forms, are in any way straightforward or clear, right? We are human beings writing texts, muddling through, and to genuinely accept the role of chance and gamble that we are all involved in, that the ways in which we are all taking risk, right, and engaged in various insurance schemes with respect to the problem of risk, is something that needs to be directly embodied in thought and not just thought about. That we really need to be thinking in the mode of risk, in the way that we live in the mode of risk. And so in that sense, with respect to the question of the image of thought, I think for sure this is, you know, in an immediate way linked up to the kind of framework of political and social crises that are faced, you know, at a variety of levels, right? It's a matter of thinking, you know, bringing theory to the exact level of that uncertainty and risk, rather than presuming that thought is one level above, one level less risky, and so able to survey it. What if we inhabit that space of risk in theory and in practice in a kind of unilateral way? And there would be many, many more things I think to talk about, but I want to be sure to get to the other questions. But yeah, thanks very much for those questions.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Rocco, for your comment and your answer. So just to announce something, we're already running late, and we wouldn't want to address all the questions today, right? We want to leave something for tomorrow, and especially the last day, we're going to have a round table where all the participants will join us in a discussion about various things. And then I think some of the questions that were carefully crafted and posted in the chat, which we will save at the end of this session, we will address those questions probably on Sunday at the end of during the debate, or mediated by Takeshi Morisato. So I would propose to go one more question, and maybe depending on how long we'll take to answer it, maybe stop there, or maybe take one more. So maybe Mahbub, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I apologize if I'm not. And I think Sophia is here, or Yuchan, I think. I'm not sure if Yuchan is still here. So whoever wants to go, but let's try to address this more quickly, and then get into the meat of the discussion maybe tomorrow, especially after tomorrow. So thank you all for the great questions. I'm really pleased that this is really going well so far, and I wish we had more time. So I'll let Rocco to handle this. So
great. Yeah, let's try to do two more. Keep them as, you know, a little bit brief. But I think Mahbub and Yu Chen were at least in line, so maybe we can cover those two, and then maybe call it a day. And yeah, anything that's left over, we can get back to. And yeah, Mahbub, it's wonderful to see you. I haven't talked to you in months, so yeah, it's great to see you. But yeah, what is your question?
Likewise, Rocco. Thank you so much for a magnificent presentation. Yeah, my question is concerning dualysis and unilateral duality. So once two terms have been dualized, and they've been unilaterally separated, and therefore thereby able to be treated radically independent of each other. What I'm wondering is, how does then one avoid relating them to those two radically independent terms, again in an epistemological manner, or more generally a philosophical manner? For instance, treating them as Platonic forms, or the results of an eidetic reduction, as formal or logical definitions, a priori intuitions, or categories. Is it to treat them in the mode of naivete that you mentioned afterward in your presentation, or some other way? And a corollary question to that is, if you dualize philosophy and science, thereby enabling an extraction of some notion of philosophical decision as an invariant, say, philosophy is double transcendence, then is that one model amongst a multitude of others that could have been extracted? If so, what are the standards of correctness between those different kinds of models without, falling back into philosophy?
Right. And yeah, and that second question I think is very difficult. That's something that I think we would have to come back to maybe in a roundtable format and really think through because I think it's a very, very deep question that deals with kind of the whole project of non-philosophy as a whole. But I think that the question about dualysis is a really good one. And I think that the answer is twofold. One is that dualysis effectively eliminates one of the two terms. So if you think about the relationship between thought and the real, non-philosophy identifies the one and the real, but doesn't then set the one next to thought as one of the terms. The one disappears as a term. The real disappears as a term because it is understood as identical in the last instance with the other term. So in a certain way, the two terms collapse. And I think one of the very interesting problems in non-philosophy is the question of the choice of the term. Because if the terms are identical in the last instance, how do you pick which one to eliminate? It becomes a kind of pragmatic decision. One could eliminate thought and dualize the same structure and then talk about the real. And it becomes simply a matter of pragmatics of what is most convenient in whatever context. But the point is that when you dualize, you have two terms, one of which becomes so inert that it's not really a term anymore. So you're really, dualysis is really folding both terms back onto one of them. But in doing that, that term itself is simplified, right? Because by collapsing the other one into it, it no longer has that constitutive set of relationships to its other term. And so I think your question about why does this not become a new kind of eidetics, right, or Platonism, is that once it is extracted from those relationships to other terms, there's no content left. The term itself, it becomes a kind of algebraic operation. And I think that's one of the key moves in non-philosophy, is that terms are translated into operations. And this is why Laruelle wants to use the language of axioms, rather than thought being a kind, even people will say, well, I never want to reify things, but there's an intrinsic reification. As soon as we name a concept and presume that it has internal structure, we've already reified it. We've already objectified it. But if we take thought, dualize it, and presume that it is nothing but a kind of operation on various other, an indefinite plurality of other concepts, right? It's converted into a kind of axiom. It doesn't have any content of its own. It only has a kind of action that can be registered through its collisions with these other concepts. So, that's where I think Laruelle's work has very deep relationships with the tradition of pragmatism, but it's pragmatism at a kind of profound level, not the kind of superficial level where people often read, say, the pragmatic tradition. It converts thought into a kind of a pragmatics at the root. So, I mean, I would love to be able to, to ask you questions back and go back and forth, but I think just in the interest of time, and I hope we had a chance to talk more, but maybe even later today or whatever. But yeah, maybe just one final question from I'm not sure if it was Yuchen Soon. Is she still here, or he?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Hello. I don't think my question is that kind of very complex question. It just seemed to me like that both Marion and Laruelle was trying to overcome philosophical dualism, which could not be overcome philosophically. I was wondering if we can find some philosophical proximity between Jean-Luc Marion and François Laruelle. Well, the example I'm going to show here is that I think the relationship between human beings and God without being is quite close to Laruelle's unilateral duality. Consider Marion affirmed that the distance between man and God is also God itself, and the words for God without being, the two terms could not be distinguished. I know they don't like each other, Marion and Laruelle, but it seems to me like that they have deeply misunderstood each other. So, well, so I was wondering if such kind of comparison, if I can compare Marion and Laruelle in this way.
Yeah, and thanks for your question. And for sure, that's there's I think a wide horizon that opens up in connecting Laruelle's project with other projects that have certain family resemblances, and certainly a major influence on Laruelle was Michel Henry, and I think Henry's theology and Marion's, that itself would be an interesting problem to think about how Henry and Marion have similar uses of phenomenology in a theological mode, but are in some ways going in opposite directions. But of course, there's tremendous amounts of work to be done. But I think Laruelle himself would want to say that at the end of the day, all of those similarities, all of these connections that can be made, if we think of them as comparisons or connections, it's taking Laruelle's project to be yet another philosophy. And I think we always can do that there's a way that Laruelle can be treated philosophically, but the entire project aims to be doing something different. And I mean, and maybe rather than Marion, I think another relationship that might be more productive would be between Laruelle and Jean-Louis Chrétien, to the extent that Chrétien turns to something that is outside of theology, or develops theology in the mode of liturgy and the mode of ritual. And that's, I think, what Laruelle always wants to do is say that there's this body of theory that can be arbitrarily sophisticated and rigorous and complete, but it still remains bound by the presuppositions of philosophy, which is that we can think, that we can use concepts in order to organize knowledge. And what's always interesting is what happens when we take a body of theory and then embed it somewhere else, embed it in some kind of material that is not linked to those concepts. And so, what happens at the moment that we take all of Marion, presume that it is coherent, and let's even presume that it's true. Everything about the saturated phenomenon is the right way to conceive of experience and the divine. But then what happens, say, if we immerse that theoretical field in something like computer science or photography? That's the moment that it would become non-philosophical. It doesn't mean that it becomes better. It's just that to the extent that it remains a theoretical field, it's philosophy. Philosophy isn't a bad thing, right? Laruelle loves philosophy. He just wants to say that philosophy can be philosophy, but it can also become a kind of object that can be introduced into non-philosophical fields. And that would be think of it as Laruelle would want to just say, Marion is wonderful. What can we do with Marion? Marion has a lot to say. Given everything that he says, if we convert that into a tool, what can we do with that tool?
Thank you, Professor. What can we do with Marion sounds like a Deleuzian question.
Yeah, and I think, and there's certainly, again, Laruelle is very, is sort of thoroughly immersed in a Nietzschean and Deleuzian problematic. And so if we see him from a philosophical point of view, I think it's always right to see him more in a kind of Deleuzian Nietzschean mode. But again, I don't think that's what even though that's where he's coming from philosophically, he still wants to be doing something that is no longer philosophy. He doesn't want to be Nietzschean. But I think you're right that it's a deep problem for non-philosophy. How can we even characterize it without stepping back into a mode that is philosophical? And this is something I'm sure by the end, maybe for the roundtable we can come back to this, because for sure Marion and related thinkers in French phenomenology will be very useful for bridging Laruelle with the Kyoto School in particular, right? That's I think a very natural connection for thinking about how Laruelle might relate, say, to Tanabe, and other thinkers for whom religion and philosophy constitute this unified problematic.
I guess on this note, we can end the conversation here for the day. I would like to thank Yu-Chen for his question and comments. And so it's 11:25-26 here, quite close to midnight in Tokyo, or in the near abroad here. So I think we can keep the conversation going, especially tomorrow. We have a really packed day, and I think Professor Gangle would like to get rest as well, and kind of gather force for another set of conversations and dialogues that we can have. So I would like to say that this is really great. I mean, we didn't expect so much people to turn out, to be honest, and I'm really glad that we're doing this and that so many passionate researchers with interest in Laruelle's work. And I hope tomorrow we'll take it towards Japan and kind of historically Japanese thought and the Kyoto School. And not only that, this will also be a testament of Laruelle's, let's say, the quality of the work that's been done over the years and how this can be expanded. So just like Professor Gangle said, what can we do with this? Now let's see, what can we do with Japanese philosophy and Japanese thought from the perspective of non-standard philosophy. There's so many things to say and to discuss, and I apologize to you all that we have to close this session today. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow and on Sunday, especially for the roundtable. We're going to bring back all these questions. We're going to save the questions and address them again, or maybe find another way, if that's not possible, to actually keep the conversation going. So I would advise everyone to exchange, contacts. If we don't know each other, let's get to know each other better, and let's collaborate in the future on various projects. And as things are going, we might even turn this into an annual event and see where it takes us. So I would like to close the session here, and would like to ask Rocco if you have anything to add or to say before we finish.
No, just thanks so much to everybody for being here and for listening. And yeah, I really look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you all, and wherever you are, if you're in Japan and you're abroad, I would say good night. If it's morning, have a great day, and if it's late afternoon, maybe take a nap and get rest or take a walk. So thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow for the continuation of our conference. And I think things are about to get way more heated, and I really like to thank Professor Gangle for actually giving this introductory tutorial, kind of prepped us all for what's to come. And now we're going to shift gears and move towards Japan. So thank you all again. Thank you, Rocco, for your great introduction, and looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Bye.